I love it when the question comes up and it's the next slide. If I don't answer it, come back in a couple of minutes. But that's exactly what the next topic is. Any other questions before we start on how do you build this team and what are they going to cost? All right. So just before we talk about that, I want to just reinforce this point from the last slide about the probability. You know, when you think about the chances, like you're sitting around the boardroom table, you've written your angel check years ago, and you want to know, is this going to happen? There's two independent variables that affect the probability that it's going to happen. One of them is the probability that the company is saleable. In other words, you think you've got something that can be sold, but is that true? And of course, there's a lot more optimism than there is reality in angel investors, because we have to be optimists, and of course the entrepreneurs are worse. So one of the important questions is this a saleable company? Very difficult thing to determine if you haven't done it 100 times. But the second one is the probability that the team actually executes. What's the, there's not any team bats 1,000. There's always a probability that they're going to fail. And there's a lot of factors in whether or not the company is saleable. And financials are important, and the market is important, intellectual property is important. There's a huge list, and every company has a different mix of factors. So I can't really do justice to that question here because it's so situationally dependent. But the exit team is the single most important factor, single most controllable factor, in determining whether a company will be sold. So the company, it's complicated and it's difficult to change. The team is easy to design, easy to change. And the members of that team that are going to have the biggest impact, always, number one is the CEO. Every buyer wants to talk to the CEO. There's no way around it. Good CEOs will sell more often than average CEOs, and poor CEOs might never be acquired. And number two is that M&A advisor. A lot of people, by the way, especially in the northeast of the US, will call that an investment banker or an iBanker. That term is getting less favor these days. Investment banking is a large industry. They do everything from secure loans to public financings as well as M&A transactions. So iBanker is a big name. It's like doctor. M&A advisors are specialists. They just do one thing. They sell companies. It's a subset of investment bankers. And a lot of people these days are just using M&A advisor because they don't want to be investment bankers. Those were the guys that invented collateralized debt obligations and just about blew up the whole world by selling junky products to pension funds everywhere. So that's the most used term, but it's not universal. Business broker, which is a different term, is a different thing. A business broker sells companies that are worth less than $10 million. An M&A advisor does what we've been talking about, sells companies that are worth more than $10 million. Very much of a generalization, but that's basically how the terminology is most often used. Question? Is there any credentialing for M&A advisors? Another one of the dirty secrets. This is a completely unregulated industry. There's no credentials. I firmly believe that a lot of people who failed as used car salesmen are now M&A advisors. There was a movement. The SEC got very serious about 5 years ago in deciding that this was an industry that was basically selling securities, selling 100% of the shares of a company. Every other part of the securities industry is regulated. And there was even a request for comments. And the SEC doesn't ask for comments until it's pretty much done. A lot of people think they're doing that for show. They already know what they want to do. That was all done. The draft regulations were actually out. And President Obama, as part of revamping the angel investment regulations, somehow got the idea that regulating this market was against the interests of the economy, because having an active M&A market for smaller companies was, in their opinion, the right thing to do. So they completely shut down the SEC's initiative to regulate the industry, which I actually applauded. I think it would have been a mess to regulate it. We didn't have the mechanism to regulate this industry, But what it means is it's a completely unregulated, uncredentialed industry, which means there's an enormous spectrum of qualities of individuals. And literally, some of them you would not want to buy a used car from. I'll talk about some of those in a few minutes, by the way. So the ideal exit team is this is a business process. If you were designing a product, you put a bunch of people on the job of designing the product, you leave them alone for a little while, you'd resource the thing. It's exactly the same. It's a project, there's a plan, there's a budget, there's a timeline. And the ideal exit team, as I said before, is the CEO, an M&A advisor, 90% of the time. There are exceptions. Some CEOs, especially CEOs that have been hired to sell the company, can do it without. There's no rules here. And I certainly don't want to be, trying to promote an expensive business service here. It's just what I believe you need to do to get this done. A small committee of the board. And the really important point in that sentence, I almost underlined it, was small. Board members are often like entrepreneurs. This is exciting. This is more fun than being on the audit committee or the compensation committee. Everybody wants to be on this. But then it becomes unmanageable. So part of success here is understanding what governance is appropriate in this situation and which board members have the skills to contribute. And again, this is where I think some of the angels can make a really big difference. If we could get the skills in the angel community up, there'd be a more obvious choice as to who to include there, and they could do more of the work and they could reduce the cost of some of these fees. Also, you need every time legal and accounting professionals. There's no way not to have both of those in the process. Even if you're less than a year old, that startup we talked about, they still needed to get accounting professionals to help them satisfy the tick box that's always there about financial statements, tax returns, and all those kinds of things.
But at this early stage of the company, you're going to have a small board anyway, so what's a small committee?
A manageable committee?
If you have a board, you're going to have a small board, so you're talking just a couple, 3 people then, maybe on this?
Even one. If there was one board member who had some knowledge and had the trust of the others. But what you don't want to have is you don't want to have to get 5 people on a call to make a decision, because then you bog the process down.
Percentage of, back to the audit thing, or accounting professionals, what percentage of these are going to have full audits?
Not very many are going to have full audits, because audits are so expensive now. The only time you really need an audit is if you're being acquired by a public company and the transaction is material. Then you're absolutely going to need an audit. The challenge is you don't know. So statistically, it's about 40% of the time that you're going to need an audit. Because some buyers just want audited financials. Maybe they're a fund and they have to provide audited financials, private equity funds, for example. So my recommendation most of the time is to do a review engagement, find a firm that understands that you're going to want them to do the prep work for an audit, and if you want to do an audit, have a pre-agreed upon price and timeline, so it can be done in a timely manner if you need it.
On that topic of audit, how important have you found is the class or reputation of the firm that does the audit? For example, if it's a good local firm versus someone with a national or international brand name, how much does that play into it?
It's actually really important. The audit profession, even though they do have regulation and credentials, also has a very wide spectrum of quality. And not only that, a lot of times what you're buying assurance and in some cases insurance. And so the preference, even for a $10 or $20 million exit, would be to have one of the big firms. The problem today in America is you can't hire one of the big firms. I went out just a couple of months ago. I thought I had a company that was big enough, and we called on all of the big 4, and 3 of them wouldn't even answer the phone. Like literally, we never got a call back. And the 4th one basically quoted something that was so outrageous, it was a polite take a hike kind of thing. The big firms are not open to new clients right now. They are so busy. And so the best you can hope for right now is getting down into the 2nd tier firms. We ended up hiring a firm that I'd never heard of called Plant Moran out of Chicago. Evidently, they're the 11th biggest firm in the country. They've got 2,000 accountants. I'd never heard of them, but they're doing some great work. But I had said to these guys, you need one of the big 4. Could not be done at any kind of a reasonable price. It's coming up in just a second, actually. I love it when that happens. You know, these M&A advisors, which are, again, a lot of the dirty secrets are because of these people. They, again, really want to watch out. But what they ideally should be doing is they're really the sales guys. This is a sale. You have salespeople that sell the product. You have a salesperson that sells your home. These are the people that sell the business. Their important functions are to plan and coordinate the process, reduce the time to closing, improve the probability of success, protect the CEO for as long as possible, and of course to maximize the price and terms. That's really what you're paying all this money for when it comes down to it. They also do the important work of being the bad guy. I feel pretty strongly after doing this myself. I sold my first company. I was the CEO. I did a bad job. I can admit that now. I'm recovering from that, emotionally at least. The CEO should not lead the process because, number one, they almost never have the experience. Anybody that I've met who's a CEO who has the experience doesn't want to be a CEO. Like, it's almost, when you think about it, if they sold a few companies and they're smart, they're not working anymore. They're certainly not working in companies we invest in. So by definition, the CEO does not have the experience. They're also desperately needed to maximize the financial results. If there was ever a time in the history of the company to have those numbers coming in just a little bit better than planned, it's while everybody's focused on the numbers. They also need to be held in reserve for the final negotiation of the price and the terms. When it comes right down to it, the buyers are going to want to be in front of the CEO, maybe even some of the shareholders. They've got to be held in reserve. And there's also an important governance point here. It's kind of subtle, but if they don't own 100% of the business, and none of our CEOs do, they are conflicted. And the conflict is primarily that they're also going to be simultaneously negotiating their next employment contract with the buyers. And it is absolutely a serious lapse of governance to let the CEO unsupervised lead that negotiation. Because from the buyer's perspective, money that they might have to pay to the CEO over the life of their contract, they don't really care whether it goes to the CEO or whether it goes to the shareholders. So there's an important governance element to this that a lot of people miss. And I've seen myself firsthand CEOs that have done things that were improper in that context. Not because they're bad people, but they just had an inflated view of their own importance and value. And I've many times talked to buyers about how angry they were at being held for ransom by the CEO. And there's a great story. If you ever want to see a public example of this, during the mortgage crisis, the CEO of one of the banks that was in trouble did this. And the people who bailed him out was so angry, they went public. And it's a great documentary, it's a few years old now, about how mad they were because that CEO held them to ransom on his comp package. It was really his severance package because he knew he was going to be severed. And it happens all the time. It's just not as usually written or talked about. But
So is that because the board's not involved?
yes, the board wasn't watching. But the last reason, and the really important reason here, is that the CEO cannot be the bad guy. The CEO has to maintain a really friendly, positive relationship with the buyers. He or she is going to be there. It's part of the deal. If the CEO doesn't get along with the people on the other side, the deal might not even happen. And in any transaction, you need to have a good bad guy or girl. Selecting the M&A advisor is one of those things that's also one of the dirty secrets. There's very little written about this. And I think it should be a full-day course. One of the reasons is that these are contracts that you cannot get out of once you sign them. They are exclusive and they are expensive, and there's no way out if you make the wrong decision. You're going to end up paying. But if you did this at all well, what you'd want to benchmark is the probability that that team, that M&A team, is going to get your transaction done. Do they really know how to do this? Are they really good? Their record of maximizing the price. And less important, but also serious considerations, are their proximity, knowledge, and compatibility. Even just the chemistry is an important consideration when you're making what may be the largest single purchase in the company's entire history of services, maybe even of product. Coming back to this bad guy just for a second.
Question.
Sir?
Proximity can be a difficult thing. Proximity means geographic proximity. Proximity means how often are you willing to fly to my city? Are you in my city? Are you less than 45 minutes away? Like, what's proximity mean?
Really good question. Proximity means a few things, but geographic proximity is one of the things that's desirable. And flying time is also a consideration. During the honeymoon phase with these M&A advisors, they will all, tell you what you want to hear. They will all tell you that they're going to be there when you need them. It doesn't matter that they're, flying. Whenever it's required, we'll be there on site to help you. That's what you're going to hear during the honeymoon phase of the process. That's what the salespeople from these firms will tell you. The reality is often much less than that. And if you can, if you're lucky to be in Edinburgh or somewhere else where these people can drive to the company, absolutely take somebody that's closer if you've got the option. But for so many people today, and where angel investing is happening everywhere now, it's often not a choice. And you then have to think about, well, what does proximity mean? And it means, what's the impediment to getting that person face to face with the company or the buyers at the times in the process that it's critical. In earlier times, the big firms on Wall Street, if they were doing, like, say, a $500 million transaction somewhere, they would rent an apartment because they knew that they were going to have enough people there that they could justify having an apartment, like a year lease kind of thing, because they were going to use that space so often. And if the transaction was big enough, the airfare didn't matter, the travel time didn't matter. But for the bulk of the transactions, which are between sort of $10 and $50 million, the economics don't work out. They won't do that. They won't fly as often as you need. So it's a real serious consideration.
There's a nexus of buyers in one area to have the M&A advisor in that area versus where you're located?
It would be if there was, but there isn't. There's nowhere in the world where there is enough buyers to make it make sense. Silicon Valley is probably the highest concentration of any kind of company anywhere in the world, IT companies. But there's still not enough probability that it's going to be there. This is really a global market now. Coming back to this bad guy thing just for a minute. Except for the work, M&A transactions are usually fun. And they always involve big money, which is exciting. And the job of both sides is to get the best price. And at some point in almost every transaction, things are going to get tense, sometimes worse. And I think this is just a fundamental characteristic of the human nature. And if you're negotiating something where, let's say the price is moving $10 million, and your job on the buying side is to get the very best price for your boss, your company, almost anything is fair game. And so, if somebody grabs the water pitcher and hurls it against the whiteboard, that's fair. And if the one side has a well-rehearsed process where everybody slams their briefcases and walks out of the room, that's fair. Bad language is pretty much the norm. Dirty tricks, everything you've ever heard about from a negotiation is done on a regular basis because there's so much money moving back and forth. And so, there are some buying teams that are just very polite people. They never say bad words, they never break things. But most of the time it gets tense. Most of the time people's tempers get, raised. These are competitive people. They're like, financial athletes, and they're fighting to win. And so if you don't get to the point where there's really significant tension in the room, I don't think you've really done the full job. You've probably left some millions on the table. And when you do that to somebody, when you go to battle with them and you squeeze every last million out of them, there's most of the time going to be some hard feelings. You know, it's not that pleasant to do that kind of combat. It's not so sportsmanlike. It's kind of like football. You know, people get angry, or hockey. People get angry. And the CEO cannot do that. The CEO has to be above that fray, even when on the other side of the table there is the CEO. And so, you know, the way that these things have been designed is they're the kind of the frontline combatants that are never the CEO, so that you can get to the best price. Both sides can do what they have to do. And that's one of the reasons you need a disposable intermediary. You need somebody who everybody knows is going to be gone after the process is over. The buyers also don't really resent it because that's their job, to be very disagreeable and keeps trying to extract another $1 million just because. But it can never be the CEO. The fees for selling companies, in most people's opinion, are extraordinarily high. And they are high. It's an expensive process. But I want to start out by saying that this is a competitive industry. There are lots of people who will offer to sell almost every company. And there's a lot of competitive activity to keep the prices where they are in the market. And there is a market. And what I'm going to be talking about here when I talk about fees is an excerpt of a blog post that I'll show you the URL for in a second. But And there are differences. There's a range here, like there is with every professional service. But if you've ever gone out to look for an audit, if you've ever gone out and priced an audit, I've done this lots and lots of times. If you go to the big 4 firms, the price you get is almost exactly the same every time from all the firms. They'll vary like less than 5% because those big firms have done this enough times to know what the market is for the service. So for any given company, they can bid so close that price doesn't become one of the choices. It's the same thing in this market. If you went out and asked 100 firms and you did a statistical analysis, the prices would be almost within 10 or 20% for the same level of service. What you'll see is it's a 2-component fee structure. When you engage an M&A advisor, investment banker, there's almost always a fee. And for a transaction in the sort of $10 to $50 million range, you're going to be looking at an initial engagement fee, work fee, some kind of a guaranteed payment of about $50,000. That's kind of the amount that is most typical medium price. But the success fee, which should be, by the way, includes that $50,000, is going to vary. It's going to vary based on the size of the company. And at the low end of the market, say the $5 million range of value, that fee could be as high as 8 to 10%. And when you get up to $10 to $30 million size companies, 5 to 7.5% is kind of the middle of the range. And then when you get up into the $100 million range, those fees are usually in the 2 to 3% range.
So how long does the $50,000 last? Is it per month or?
Good question. A lot of times that's can be paid monthly. You can negotiate and make that, say, $5,000 a month for 10 months. Some firms won't cap that, though. Some firms will make it a monthly fee, and some engagements, that's appropriate. You have to really understand what it is there that you're agreeing to when you are comparing these offers. And what I've been trying to do for a number of years now is I've got a blog post where I kind of aggregate data. Again, not a database. I don't have a database. I do write them down, but it's not a database process. I just, whenever I can, I'll ask friends that are CEOs. I'll ask angels that have hired M&A advisors. I'm just kind of curious about this. And that blog post of mine is actually the world's most popular reference on M&A fees because nobody else is talking about it, which I think is kind of funny in this world where information wants to be free. It's really hard to get this information, which is one of the reasons that motivates me because I'm a difficult personality. I want to try and illuminate this. I want to make this more transparent. I'm confused too, but literally it was President Obama. And it was like not more than, say, 2 or 3 years ago. This was recent news.
I'm just trying to reconcile. I think the earlier charts around how long it takes, a number of man years to sell a company, there was an inflection point that popped after a year. probability of an exit, so 50 grand should want to last 2 years, or at least longer than a year, want to. Is that enough money to make it last longer than a year?
You know, an interesting part of the process when you're interviewing these M&A advisors is none of them are doing it for the 50,000.
Sure.
And by the way, it doesn't. The smallest I've ever seen is like 5,000 a month. So 10 months maybe. A lot of times it's just an upfront fee, especially these days because everybody's busy. And it's kind of like a test. It's a way that the M&A advisor tests the company's sincerity. Because a lot of companies are just curious. And one of the reasons there is a fee is so that the M&A advisors don't do a great deal of work and end up having a huge out-of-pocket cost. And by the way, that's about half of what it would typically cost. That, like the out-of-pocket cost, not the manpower, but the expenses to do a fully marketed transaction are probably about $100,000. So you get this feeling there's a partnership between the M&A advisor and the company is kind of how that works. Did that end?
Include the accounting and
Nope.
the legal.
Nope.
So
Next slide.
This is just advisor.
This is just the advisor.
That makes me feel a little better. In terms of what's reality? Is maybe 6 figures, not 50.
Yes.
To actually get it done.
Yes. And what's happening when you're interviewing these M&A advisors, it's a two-way interview process. They're trying to see if your company is saleable. Because they're not doing it, well, sorry, most of them aren't doing it for the 50,000. I'll talk about some that are in a minute. But the reason they're doing it is to get these success fees. So they're evaluating, is this company saleable? It's a great way to find out. They're also trying to assess whether you're sincere. Like, how motivated are you? Because they don't want to do 1 or 2 man-years of work for $50,000. They want to do it for the percentage, which is, of course, some 7-digit figure in all of these examples. Sir?
One experience that we've had is the work fees are what the monthly retainers are. As you say, it's not what they're in it for the success fee. So we'll ask for 100% credit of the monthly retainers or the work fees to be applied against the success fee. If they sell the company, then we get our credit. If they don't sell the company, then they've generated their work fees.
That's
It's a negotiating point to save yourself a little bit of money.
It's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up because you're right. That work fee, in my opinion, should be a deposit on that success fee, a prepayment, if you will. And you got to be careful because I think about 1/3 of the time when I see it, it's not. And then you do need to have that negotiation. Sir?
And that's one of the ranges that 30 to 100 million is where most of our transactions might occur. And the high end of one is 2 million, the low end of the other is 2 million. So does that imply it's pretty much 2 million across the spectrum?
Exactly. You're quick at math. So what you're recognizing there is that the amount of work to sell a $10 million company is not 1/10 of the amount of work to sell a $100 million company. There's a certain amount of work. And so the fee structure is scaled so that the amount of the fees it changes. There's more fees than selling a bigger company. It's kind of but it's not linear to the size of the company. And of course, if the angels can do more of the work, all of this is negotiable, right? And the people who do this for a living are like the professional accounting firms and legal firms. If you can do some of the work, they're perfectly happy to give you a solution that matches what you need. This is a fully marketed transaction. This is doing all the things we talked about in the timeline. And there are lots of situations where a specific company might need a subset of those things. Rarely is there more work. Like, this is pretty much all the work that there is to be done, other than the legal and accounting, which is coming up next. But let me just say one thing about these fees. There is a range. And the range probably varies plus or minus, let's say 2, maybe 2.5%. And what you're seeing there is an acknowledgement of the fact that there are different qualities. There are some firms that are really good, and they're going to be up, they're going to have 1 or 2% more in their fees. There are some firms that are really bad. They're going to have a 1 or 2% lower success fee. And what I think is important to keep in mind is, if you look at this graph, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to show that the range between the low, average, and high quality firms, the range in the price might literally be plus or minus 50%. and I had a different shaped graph that showed the same thing earlier. The range in the fees is actually much smaller. So the thing to keep in mind is, where do you think that red line is between what they're going to cost you and what they're going to deliver? And again, the slopes and everything, it's all situationally dependent. It's highly variable. But that's the question. What are you going to pay and what are you going to get? Like it is with anything else you buy. What is the product and what is the price? The problem with this process is we're not really clear most of the time what the product is. What is it, Mr. or Ms. M&A advisor, you're giving me for this percent of this transaction that you're signing me up for? And it's really quite difficult to be sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at 2 or 3 of these firms. And I think you should always talk to 3 firms. Get to know 3 firms before you make a decision, because these are such expensive engagements and so difficult to get out of. Legal and accounting fees also vary quite widely depending on the complexity of the transaction. They don't vary on the size of the transaction. But I've seen, for example, very simple $50 million size transactions and very complicated $10 million size transactions. For a simple, very clean transaction, my lawyer friends will howl when I say this, I have seen the legal fees be under $25,000. But I've also seen situations where the legal fees were well over $1 million. And it's almost, sometimes you're not even sure which one you're getting into at the outset. It really depends a lot on the corporate structure. It depends on how things go. When you get up to $1 million, it usually means something's gone wrong, as does happen. Accounting fees can also vary quite over a wide range. It can be a few thousand to over 100,000 if you need to have audits. These days an audit, starting price for an audit is probably, it depends where you are. In a big city, starting prices are getting up to sort of $50,000 for an audit. In the rural areas, same work, maybe half or a third of that. Start adding in multiple offices in multiple countries, and the audit fees will go up dramatically. The accounting fees usually get paid well before the transaction. The legal fees usually get paid from the transaction. Any questions on fees and the team? Yeah.
For some reason, in my city, there are law firms that just want to do the whole thing themselves, law firms and accounting firms. They want to be an M&A advisor, and they just want to take it on. And so we have so much experience, and then since they do a lot of deals inside their law firm, you have to know it's all secret. It's my privilege all the way through. So, what do you think about just the lawyers doing the law firm as M&A advisor or the accounting firm as M&A advisor?
Thank you for an excellent question. And this is happening a lot. This is a professional service. So, M&A advisory started out on Wall Street with the big investment banks. And then what happened after Sarbanes-Oxley and all the difficulties we had 15 years ago, we saw the first big accounting firm go bankrupt. Completely gone. Arthur Andersen's gone. And the accounting people sort of took notice of that and realized that they weren't in the same industry that they were in back in the 90s. And they decided to diversify. So the accountants first got into the M&A business. And all of the big accounting firms now have M&A teams that will sell companies. And I'm getting a look here that's exactly my impression. It's like, to me, it's kind of like, I don't know what a good analogy would be. It'd be kind of like, I don't even know. Accountants do a certain kind of work, and lawyers do a certain kind of work. They went to school for it, and then what they're doing, as you pointed, they're getting into the other, they're covetous of the other business. And they're thinking, well, if we can do all 3 parts, if we were a law firm, we could do the accounting and we could capture more of the wallet share. Perfectly good business strategy. I question whether that's the right strategy for the client, though. I think this is pretty specialized work, and I think that it'd be a little bit like your M&A advisor saying, "Don't worry, I can do accounting, I can do I can do the legal part too." I just think these are such specialized areas of practice that you have to be an expert. You should be an expert in each one. And I think that when you get a, one price does all, you get kind of what that would suggest.
I had a question on the M&A firms. If I understand right, I mean, part of your message is that some of these tech companies could be selling pre-revenue successfully, but some of the folks I know in the smaller boutique M&A firms, I think, have a much more traditional view. I feel like if I go to them and say, hey, I've got this pre-revenue tech company, they're like, nah, come back to me when you hit 10 million in revenue on it. I mean, how do you deal with that? Are there some M&A firms that sort of support this position you take?
It's a really, really good question. I mean, you talked about lawyers and accountants doing it. Even the people who are M&A advisors are subspecialized in different areas. And I think I've heard this from so many people. In fact, I often get phone calls because I've got a website. Everybody in the world can find everybody in the world now. So I get these phone calls probably a couple a week from somebody somewhere who says, okay, Basil, I got this company. I know it's saleable. Maybe I've even got somebody interested, and we're not profitable yet. And I've been turned down by 10 investment banks now. 10 M&A advisors have said, no, we don't do that work. And 3/4 of them don't do this kind of angel type exit work. And it's probably gone from 75% to 85% because what's happened in the market, because of the surplus of capital, everybody who does this kind of work now is busy. And it's a lot easier to sell a company with 5 years of growing profits than it is to sell a company that's all IP. And so very often the M&A advisors, when they're busy, will send people away because they don't really know how to do smaller transactions efficiently, or they don't know how to sell a company that doesn't have years of EBITDA. It's a really big problem. And part of my goal here is I think that the angels can come up and do more of this work. With some experience, I think it's possible to learn to do some of this. I keep hoping the market's going to respond, because one of the things we talk about in the first workshop is that the median size of an M&A transaction for a private company in North America is around $12 million. Might be 15. So half the time when a company gets sold, it's for less than 12 or $15 million. So the bulk of the transactions are actually between about 10 and $20 million. And most of the M&A advisory firms won't do things of that size. Most of the firms, even the boutiques, 6 guys in some rural part of somewhere, $10, $20 million transaction isn't big enough to get them interested. It's a business opportunity.